Did you know that military records are some of the most detailed and story-rich documents that we deal with in family history? So as you're building out your family tree, there are a lot of opportunities to learn a lot about not just the lives of your military ancestors, but those who were close to them as well. I'm Krista Cowan. I'm the corporate genealogist here at Ancestry, and I'm so excited that you're all here today with me. We're going to spend about an hour today together talking about how to find military documents on Ancestry and fold3.com and newspapers.com, and a little bit about some of the records at the National Archives. And then we will talk about how to extract the stories from those records and where to keep that information in your family tree so that it's accessible to you and to your family members. So before we dive into where to find these records, what I would love to hear from you in the chat is whether or not you have a parent or grandparent who served in the military. US, Canada, UK, Australia, wherever you are from, wherever your parent or grandparent is from. If you could just tell me which parent or grandparent and what branch of the military they served in for which country, because that's going to give me an idea of who's here live and kind of if I need to tailor some of our resources and examples to that. Okay, so it looks like we've got lots of fathers who were in the Army. Ooh, we've got a mother who was in the RAF in the UK. Lots of fathers in the Army. Some who served in World War I, some who served in World War II. It looks like some who served in Korea. We've got a mother who was in the Navy. That's exciting. A father who was in the Army Air Corps. A dad in the National Guard. This is great. Okay, we've got a UK Army. Both parents served in World War II for the UK. A dad in the Navy. Okay, this is great. This is super helpful to me to understand. Ooh, I just saw a word I didn't know. World War II Navy coxswain. I don't know what that is. I'm so interested to learn more. Army Corps of Engineers. Okay, Royal Air Force. Super helpful. Okay. Anzac in World War I. So some of you have not just grandparents or parents, but uncles. I think that's great. Okay. Super helpful. Thank you. That's going to help me tailor our time together and give you some pertinent examples. So we are going to start with the current time period and work our way backward, because I think most of you know it appears that you have parents or grandparents who served in the military. But what you might not know is how to gain access to those records. So before I share that with you, I do want to share this chart with you that was created by Fold3. So fold3.com is a company that Ancestry bought a few years ago, quite a few years ago now. And they house a lot of military records due to some of their original contracts, digitization agreements with the National Archives here in the United States. Now, they've since expanded that purview. It goes out now to Forces War Records and some of the UK and Australia and Canadian military records as well. So this chart is very US-centric. We haven't created one yet for any of the other countries. I'm kind of curious. I probably should do that. If you want to take a screenshot now, that's fine. If you want, I'll share this on my social media later today so that you have access to it there as well. But basically what this is it's to start to get you in the frame of mind to know what are the birth year ranges for individuals who would have served in particular conflicts. Now, a lot of you may have parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles who served in the military in non-wartime, and that's valuable service as well. But this is focused particularly on wartime military service. And again, this chart specifically is for the US. And here's just how you read this chart. We're going to start at the bottom. We're going to work our way up. So if you were eligible to serve in the Vietnam War, which went from 1964 to 1975, you most likely were born between 1914 and 1955. If you served in the Korean War, which was from 1950 to 1953, you most likely were born between 1900 and 1936. Okay. If you served in World War II. So do you see what's happening here? So this is how you read this chart. So the battle years and then the birth years of the individuals who would have served during that time period. So I think it's just a really handy look. If you want to, again, just take a screenshot of this, you're welcome to do that. Or if you are looking at family members who served in a different country, some of these wars your countries were also involved in, maybe at different times. So for example, World War II, the US got involved later than most of the countries in Europe. And so you might need to adjust that just a little bit. But it's super helpful to start to think about what military conflicts were going on, because what happens is we have people who serve in the military constantly and they choose that as a career or it's a calling for them. But then we see this surge in military service, of course, during wartime, typically because of drafts or because of the sentiment around that particular conflict. And so when you think about who might have been eligible to serve, charts like this are super, super helpful. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about the Vietnam War just briefly. So one of the challenges in most places when we're doing family history research and we're looking for the stories is privacy laws. So every country has their own privacy laws that govern whether or not they have made public access of those records. And in the case of the Vietnam War, none of those records have been made public yet. Now, hopefully you still have family members alive who either were the ones who served or who knew the ones who served. And I would encourage you to talk to them. Not everybody who served, particularly in wartime, is comfortable or willing to talk about their military service. I have two grandfathers, don't we all, who served in World War II. One of them kept a diary of his experiences during the war. He talked about it with his family. He shared some of those experiences when he came home. The other one never spoke about it. In fact, I asked him about it on several occasions, and he refused to talk about it. My grandmother, however, had lots of things to say because she was proud of my grandfather's service, because they were married before he shipped out, because he served in both the European and the Pacific theaters. She had a lot to say about what she knew about his experience, but he personally never wanted to talk about it and didn't really want her talking about it with him there. I expect it was pretty traumatizing for him. And so when you're talking to people, particularly people around the Vietnam War, the Korean War, World War II, if you still have some of them available to you, just recognize that for some of the people who actually served, talking about that service is traumatic and painful. So approach it gently, see if they're willing to talk about it, but also consider talking to the other people in their lives that they may have communicated with, written letters to, communicated with or talked to when they got home. Just think about who those people might be. So Vietnam records, Vietnam era records are still private. Now, Korean War era records are just now starting to be made public. There is in both Vietnam, Korea, World War II, World War I, here in the United States and elsewhere, a draft instituted. So here in the US, every man over the age of 18 was eligible to be drafted. And the upper age range changed throughout the war as they needed to expand the time period or the number of men, the pool of men available. And then, of course, as the war progresses, you have men aging into eligibility as they turn 18. So every male had to register for the draft. So there will be draft cards. It is important to remember, though, that just because a draft card exists does not mean the person served. And so you need to think about that as well. So we're going to take a look at our first set of records today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And we are going to close this tab. And we are going to come over here. If you've spent any time with me online or at genealogy conferences, you know my favorite resource on the entire Ancestry website is the card catalog. And that's because it's a really quick and easy way to get to specific record collections. And so I can just come here and I can type in the keyword or the title, what record collection I'm looking for. And in this case, I'm looking specifically for these Korean War era draft cards. Now, like I said, you're going to start to see more Korean War records come online as privacy laws around those records start to expire. Ancestry is currently digitizing the U.S. Korean War era draft cards. So those are from 1948 to 1959. So even though the Korean War did not span that whole time period, the expansion of the draft cards we're calling the Korean War era because of the conflicts that were going on. Now, if you scroll down on any database on Ancestry, past the search boxes, what you're going to see are two things. You're going to see some source information. So this is where Ancestry obtained these records from, who the actual original owners of the records are. And then you're going to see a database description. This collection is a little bit unique. So Ancestry is currently actively digitizing these records from the originals, which means it's kind of slow going. And rather than waiting for the whole 2 years or so that it's going to take for us to digitize and index these records, we made the decision to go ahead and release them in batches as we completed them. So we released the first batch earlier this year. Actually, I think we've released 2 batches so far this year. And you can see here the list of states. Let me make that a little bigger for you on your screen. You can see here the list of states that have been completed. So if you have family members who lived in one of these states, then these are the records that are currently available in this Korean War era draft card collection. Just know that we'll be releasing new states every few months or so, and we'll usually do it in batches of 2 or 3 or 4 states at a time. Okay, so if you have family in this collection, let me just show you what one of these cards look like, because these are really fantastic cards. We're going to use a Utah celebrity. This gentleman was the winningest coach in BYU football history. As a matter of fact, our football stadium is named after him. And at the time, he was in college. So he was going to school up at Utah State, and he was playing football, and he was also in the ROTC. So that's kind of a fun connection with him. Now, the index for these records is on Ancestry. So you're on Ancestry. This is where you're going to get hints. This is where you're going to be able to do searches to find people in these record collections. But the actual image itself lives over on Fold3. Now, remember I mentioned fold3.com is a website that was established with digitization contracts with the National Archives, where they were digitizing military records. Ancestry purchased that company years ago. We've maintained it as an independent website for a couple of reasons. One is it allows us to just really focus on this military theme in this space and provide a search experience and a browse experience that's unique to these records. The other reason is because there's people who are interested in military history who aren't interested in family history. I know. I don't understand it either, but it's true. And so this gives them a platform where if all they want to do is look into military history, they can access this. Now, for those of you who have an Ancestry subscription, if you have the Ancestry all access level subscriptions. So you can have one for your country, US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, okay? You can have the world, which is everything on Ancestry, or you can have all access, which is everything on Ancestry, all the records, everything on Fold3, and everything on newspapers.com. So Ancestry all access subscriptions give you access to Fold3. So when you want to see the actual image of this document, it lives over there. So you're going to need to have access to that. So let's take a look at these cards. These particular cards, so here we've got Lavelle Rubin Edwards, we've got his permanent address, which is in Orem, Utah, but his mailing address, he's living at the Sigma New House up in Logan, Utah. That's where Utah State University is. I think it was called Utah State Agricultural College at the time. His person, so you always have to give the name and address of a person who will always know your address, is his father, who's living at that same address in Orem. Over here we have his date of birth and his place of birth. Up here we've got his selective service number. We've got an occupation, which is student. He's a physical education student in Logan. And then you have some other little details. Always pay attention to the details because you never know what you're going to discover. For example, question 12 here is, were you ever rejected for service in the armed forces? So that might be interesting and give you a clue whether or not this person actively served, even though they had to register for the draft, whether they served or not. You've got marital status, and then if they're married, kind of what their circumstances are about that, and then whether or not they have children, whether they are a father. So that is how you read the front side of those cards. Now, there is a back side with most draft cards, with a lot of military records, pension files, and service records. There are sometimes multiple pages. So always check a few pages before and a few pages after to make sure you're looking at the whole file. You don't want to miss anything. So on the back side of this card, we are going to see some additional information. I'm going to see if I can make it a little bigger for y'all. There we go. Okay. So you've got information about active duty. So if they served in World War II, or during that time period, you're going to have an indication of this on their Korean War draft card. You're also going to see if they have any present membership in a reserve component of the armed forces. So any reserves, if they're in the National Guard, if they're in this case, he's in the ROTC, and then what the date of enlistment was and what their grade is. You're going to see their signature, which is always fun if you've never seen a signature of a family member before. And then you're going to get a description of the registrant. In this case, blue eyes, brown hair, medium complexion, 6 feet tall, weighs 185 pounds. He's white and he has no physical identifying characteristics. That's where you're going to see things like scars and tattoos in particular. And then you get the date and location of the registration. So those Korean War era draft cards are a gold mine of information and absolutely worth investigating further. And think again, don't just think about dad or grandpa. Think about, do you have uncles? Do you have older brothers? Anybody that would have been alive during that time period between the late 1940s and the late 1950s who would have been over the age of 18 and required to register for the draft. You're going to get a really rich set of information about them. Now, that does not mean, again, that they served. It just means that they were required to register for the draft. So to discover more about their service, again, because it's so recent, you're not going to find a lot of records online. But what you are going to find are newspapers. So newspapers are a really rich source of information and story for military service. Because what happens is very often the local newspaper will want to report on when an individual in their community enlisted, when an individual in their community went off to basic training, when they finished basic training, if they advanced in rank in any way, if they became an officer, if they came home on leave, if they were sent overseas to serve in a particular conflict, if they were injured in any way, if they were missing in action, if they were taken prisoner of war, if they died in service. All of that is typically reported in local newspapers. And let me tell you, the smaller the town they came from, the more likely it is to be mentioned in the newspaper. And so think about that as well. Now, let me just share with you newspapers.com. If you're not familiar with newspapers.com, it is something that I think is absolutely worth your time and effort. So this is, again, part of the Ancestry suite of family history sites. We maintain it as a separate site because there are people who are interested in social history who are not interested in family history. And so this gives them a platform that they can use without having to dive fully into Ancestry. But if you have an Ancestry All Access subscription, you have access to newspapers.com. And when you come to log in, you just log in with your Ancestry ID. So it's the same login even. Now, searching in newspapers is a little tricky. I'm not going to use Lavelle Edwards for this example because actually, maybe I will because I'm curious to see if I can constrain it based on years. I mentioned he was a very popular football coach, and you'll see as soon as I pull up his name, of course, I put it in quotes because I want to keep that name together on the newspaper page. If you do not include the quote marks when you do newspaper research, what's going to happen is you're going to find pages of newspaper where this name is up here and this name is down here. And it's not your person, obviously, because the two names are not together. So you put quote marks around it to keep them together. You can filter it by location by just clicking on the state. You can also toggle to different countries here and see what records are available in those places. You can see these are the locations where we currently have newspaper content. I can just tap on the state to filter to that specific state, tap again to toggle that on and off as a particular filter. Now, I can also put in a date range. So I'm going to come up here and just put in 1945 to 1955 and see if we can get that down to a little bit more reasonable set of search results. And it looks like because of his sports career, I'm going to see a lot of mentions. So what I would recommend then is to include other keywords as you search. So I could put in things like ROTC and see what comes up. And in this case, it looks like we have a few possible mentions of his ROTC service. And so I could go through each of those to see if there was additional information about that. I could type in a word like military and see what that gives me. I could type in a word like Army and see what that gives me. Okay, so again, you're using the name and a keyword. I could also type in, so for example, I know he was from Orem and I know he was in the ROTC. So if you know the name of the specific town, or if you happen to know the name of a parent, because oftentimes when it's reported in the newspaper, it'll say things like, instead of saying Lavelle Edwards, it'll say things like Lavelle, son of Philo, Mr. and Mrs. Philo Edwards. And so it will list the full name of the father. Most often the father's full name is listed. Unfortunately, even until the mid to late 1970s, women were listed as Mrs. and then their husband's name. So keep that in mind if you're looking for women. And so that's kind of the way that you play with this. And when you find an article, let's see if I can get this to open. There we go. When you find an article, that is going to give you sometimes just a little snippet. So we're going to read this one. Lavelle Edwards of Orem, student at the Utah State Agricultural College, has completed 6 weeks of intensive training at the Fort Lewis ROTC summer camp. When he completes his college course next year, he will receive a commission as a second lieutenant in the Organized Reserve Corps. Okay, so now we know exactly when he went to this ROT summer camp. Where? Fort Lewis. I think that's in Washington, Washington State. We know that he was commissioned as an officer likely after his schooling was done. And so we can go look and see if there's additional information around that time period in the newspaper about him actually being commissioned. So we start to piece together sometimes just these little 6 or 8 or 10 or 2-line snippets in newspapers, and we can really create a story around their service in the military, whether that was full service in wartime, ROTC or reserve service, National Guard service, other types of military service. So I love newspapers because they can just get you to some of these little snippets of insight that maybe you didn't know before. And the other great thing about newspapers in all aspects of family history is that they can help you start to build a timeline. Because if it was published in the newspaper on a specific date, at the very least, you can trust that that date is correct. And so you know something didn't happen after that date because they can't publish it in the newspaper before it happened. So that gives you kind of an idea around how to search newspapers in order to find snippets of family history stories. Now, we're talking specifically about Korean War era draft cards. This example I used was from a Korean War era individual, but that works for any time period and just about any country as well. As you saw, we have newspapers for the UK, we have newspapers for the UK and Ireland, we have newspapers for Canada and Australia, as well as the United States. And so you can do searches for individuals by name in quote marks, and then rotate through some of those keywords, use some of those year range filters, see if you can't get it down to a reasonable size. Remember to search for fathers' names as well. And every once in a while, you also have to search for people by initials. So I could have searched for him as L.R. Edwards if what I was looking for didn't come up immediately. So those are just some search tips for you. Okay, let's move back in time again. So we're going to go now to World War II era military service. So World War II, of course, it affected the countries that almost all of us have family from. It's why it's called a world war. And we have extensive records from that time period in newspapers, in draft cards, in some service records. So in order to talk about service records, we need to talk about here in the United States, a fire that occurred in the 1970s. In the 1970s, all of the military service records for all of the conflicts that had happened from that date previous back to World War I. So Vietnam, Korea, World War II, World War I. All of those service records, and a service record just has all the details about a soldier, their enlistment date, all of their physical description information. Sometimes there's photos. There is then detailed descriptions about rank and advancement and where they served and who they served with, what regiments or companies they served with, what tasks they did, if they had any medical action, right? So health issues or injuries, illnesses. You're going to get so much rich detail in those service records. Unfortunately, there was a fire in the St. Louis Personnel Records Office where those records were held. And a vast majority of those records were destroyed in that fire. It's estimated that around 80% of the Army records were destroyed. It was a less percentage of Navy records and Marine records, but the Army and the Army Air Corps, which then became the Air Force, those records were mostly destroyed. So I, for example, have written to the National Archives to see if the records of either of my grandfathers survived, and neither of them did. Both of them served in the Army, my one grandfather in the ROTC and then enlisted, the other grandfather in the Arkansas National Guard and then enlisted. And so those service records no longer exist. However, the young men, when they were discharged, were asked often to go to their local county courthouse and file paperwork with their local county courthouse about their military service. And so if you write the National Archives to see if records for a parent or grandparent or uncle exist, and they tell you those records no longer exist, the next thing I would do is contact the county courthouse where they were living when they were discharged to see if they have any indication of service records for that person. If they don't, this is where you have to start to piece together information about their service from other sources. Now, this is a US problem. In Canada, there are records, but those records are not yet public. And so you do have to contact the government to get access to the records for a particular family member for World War II. World War I era records are public. In the UK, similar situation, right? World War II records are not yet public. Sometimes you can access them if you are an immediate family member. World War I records are accessible. Now, in the UK, World War I records suffered similar damage. This was due to, I believe, a bombing, if I remember correctly, during World War II. World War I service records were burned. And so, again, a large percentage of them were destroyed. However, Ancestry, in conjunction with the National Archives, has digitized a lot of those records, and you can see them. We'll look at some examples here in just a minute. So you have to kind of start thinking about what country was my family member serving for, what privacy laws are making records available or not available, and then were any of those records destroyed or damaged, and then where do I find other records? So let's dive into that where do I find these other records question, and we are going to go right back to our trusty card catalog. And I'm going to give you a different way to search in the card catalog. Typically, when I teach about the card catalog, I talk about coming in here and just typing in the name of a country, or if you know the name of the record set that you're looking for, you can find it very quickly that way. That's why I love the card catalog. It's a quick way to get to the 1950 census or the 1921 census. But down here on the side, you also have filters. And one of those filters is a military category. And so if I just click military, it's going to filter the 33,000 databases on Ancestry down to just the 1,400 that are specifically collections of military records. Now, I sometimes just like to browse through these lists because it helps me start to think about the kinds of records that exist that never occurred to me before. And that's kind of like, we don't know what we don't know. And the newer we are in family history, the more we don't know what we don't know. And so we have to start to expand our horizons about what's possible and what records exist. And the card catalog is a really great way to do that. So just exploring it. Now, you can use additional filters. You can filter further by specific military type records, but I would actually recommend filtering by location. So in this case, we are going to filter by Europe, and then we are going to come down here to scrolling, the United Kingdom, and then we are going to filter specifically to England. And here's where we're going to see the list of 130 now databases that are military records pertaining to people from England, or that the records were obtained from the National Archives at Kew. Again, just kind of skim through these records, you'll get an idea of the kinds of records that exist and how large these collections are. So even though in some cases, World War I in England, service records might not exist because they might have been destroyed by fire, or here in the US, World War I, World War II, Korean, Vietnam era records might not exist because they might have been destroyed in that fire. You can see all the other kinds of records that might help you piece together an ancestor's story of their service. Prisoner of war records, audio files that tell the story of different oral histories that different soldiers provided. Honors and awards, medals, like those kinds of commendations are often listed in separate databases that have been collected or created over time. Hospital registers. So if somebody was injured or got ill and was admitted to the hospital, sometimes there are details about that. And sometimes in the detail of the hospital register, we have additional information about their service or how or why they were injured or fell ill. We've got some additional medal cards. There are some smaller unit service records in the UK in particular. There's also other types of militaristic organizations that individuals may have served in. So here in the US, for example, we often think about the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines. But sometimes we forget about the Coast Guard or the National Guard or the Merchant Marines, or right? Like we forget about other ways that people served. And so when you have a family member or a story of a family member that's come down that says, oh yeah, this person served in the military, sometimes our biases or our life experience just leads us to somehow in a game of telephone morph that story and we think, oh, grandpa served in the Army. You weren't actually told that. You were told he served in the military, but somehow it got translated to that in your brain. Stuff like that happens to all of us all the time. And so unless you have documentation of him serving in specifically that branch of the armed forces, be willing to kind of expand what you think that means. Now, if you're not sure, looking through a list like this on the card catalog is a really great way, again, to like see what kinds of other organizations existed and what records are available for those organizations. But there could be other clues. You're going to look to places like newspapers. You're going to look in personal family papers. If you have any photos of grandpa in a uniform, or great grandpa in a uniform, or grandma in a uniform, look really closely at that image and see if you can determine or ask online in various military family history Facebook groups. You can find people who are willing to or who are knowledgeable about how to identify that uniform or the medals or other what I don't even know what those are called, like the bars or the different things that are on their uniform. Sometimes they can very quickly, because of their experience, identify what branch of the military they served in. Sometimes they can also give you the rank. Sometimes they can also give you more details about what conflicts they might have served in because of what is on their uniform. And so if you have those photos and you're willing to share them with people in some of those groups, you can often get help identifying exactly when and where this particular family member may have served. So again, just be willing to kind of go through these the card catalog looking at what kinds of records are available. Here we have Home Guard records, right? Civil defense records. So civil defense, I assume in the UK is similar to civil defense here in the US, which is people who are not necessarily in the military but are government contractors. So in the case of several of my family members, cousins and uncles on different branches of my family tree, there are people who were not eligible for military service. They had a bad heart or their vision wasn't great. And so they weren't allowed to either enlist and they were not eligible for being drafted, even though they had to register for the draft. Oftentimes on that draft card, it'll have some of that information. And so you can have a pretty good indication, oh, they're calling out that he has a bad heart. He probably wasn't allowed to serve. But particularly in times of conflicts, so wars and other military action, people have such a desire to serve that they will find other ways to serve. And civil defense contractors is one of those ways. And so look again for clues about that. So you may have heard, oh, Uncle Joe served in the Army, but then you can find no evidence of Uncle Joe serving in the Army. Maybe what he did was he worked on an Army post and was a civil contractor for them. So look for those kinds of records as well. There are occasionally, and this is really important, those audio files and war diaries in the US. We'll take a look here in just a minute. You'll see video files. There are people who have talked about their military experience, and it may not even mention your ancestor. But spending time with those records helps you gain an understanding of their experience. So I have a copy of my grandfather, my maternal grandfather's World War II war diary. And in it, he mentions like lots of personal experiences, but he also mentions buddies that he was with and experiences that they were having and battles that they fought. And sometimes he even drew pictures of like the way that the troops were going to be advancing. He served most primarily in Italy during World War II. And so he talks about like the mountains they had to climb and sometimes the valleys that they were in that would get flooded and then everything would be wet. And I mean, he just gives these really beautiful descriptions of a really horrible time that he was going through during the war. And um, the original is in the possession of my cousin, but one of my mom's cousins, so my grandpa's niece, took a copy of it and she went throughout all of Italy and followed my grandfather's time in the war and took modern pictures. And then she included the diary and her experiences and photos in a book that I have about my grandfather's military service. Now, that's amazing and it's a treasure, and I love it because I have this story about my grandfather. But it has also occurred to me that there are probably 25 or 30 other individuals that my grandfather served with that are mentioned in his diary. And so on Ancestry now, I can start a network. I haven't done it yet because it's a project I'm going to have to tackle, but I can start a network because I have Ancestry Pro Tools, and I can come in here and here's my cute grandpa in his cute little army hat. I can come in here and create a network that allows me to document the information about each of those individuals. And I can do that with a military network that allows me to enter the names of all those individuals, upload the pages from the diary, start to find out who they were and where they ended up. Did they survive the war? Did they not survive the war? Do their children and grandchildren have any idea that this story about their grandfather's military service exists? It just happens to be told in first person from my grandfather's point of view, but still a huge treasure for anybody else. So Ancestry does have some war diaries online, some audio files of oral interviews, some video files of footage that was taken during particularly World War II, but there's also some from World War I. And so even if your ancestor is not mentioned in that, go explore those collections because you never know what you're going to discover that's going to expand your story about what your ancestors' experience was like. So that's what I want to encourage all of you to do. If you get nothing else out of our time together today, this is it. Just come in here to the card catalog, filter by military, filter by the location where your family member was from, and then just explore what is on that list. So we're going to hop over here to Canada next so that you can see only 38 databases of records for Canada. But again, the types of records that you're going to get: Air Force crash cards, Royal Canadian Air Force crash cards. I'm super curious about that. Reports about crashes. You never know what you're going to find. People who survived or did miraculous things, or even the stories of people's final moments. We have these World War II records and service files. That collection has about 43,000 records in it. Hospital registers, homestead grants. This gets kind of interesting and gets us into a topic that I want to make sure we touch on, which is there were different benefits at different times offered for military service, especially during times of conflict. So in this case, Canadian soldiers were granted homesteads following World War I. And so as part of their pay for their service, they received a homestead grant that allowed them to get property. Now, often that property was going to be further west, right, than some of the eastern settlements. And it was one of the ways that the country kind of expanded. But that is an indication that if your ancestor received property as part of a homestead grant, that they served in the military. Here in the US, we most often see that with Revolutionary War and War of 1812 service members. So they receive land grants, and there are often that paperwork often exists that talks about the land grants that they received or that they cashed in, essentially. So that is an interesting military type record that it might not occur to you is a military record. Loyalist claims, this is kind of an interesting thing, right? So during the American Revolution, of course, what is now the United States is fighting against Great Britain. And a lot of the people in the United States, the colonies at the time, who remained loyal to the British government, they were called loyalists. After the Revolutionary War, when the US won, they were still loyal to the British government, and so a lot of them fled up into Canada. And so we can see some Canadian loyalist claims. So they were American loyalists to the British government, and they wanted to claim lost property because they had to flee, all sorts of things that they tried to make right for themselves. And so that was one of the ways they did that. And so again, that gives you an idea or an indication of not just did they serve, did they not serve, but where did their loyalties, literally in this case, lie? Like what side did they side with? Muster rolls, you're going to see a lot of those. You're going to see a lot of those. You're going to see them here in Canada. You're going to see them a lot in the US, particularly in the US during the Civil War. So the US war between the states, the US Civil War, you're going to see muster rolls. And those muster rolls just simply are a muster is basically a roll call. So you're checking to see who's still here. And sometimes that was after a battle to see who survived. Sometimes that was like people had gone on leave. Particularly during the US Civil War, soldiers would go home for planting season and help keep the farm going, and then they would come back to service, and then they would go home for harvest season and then come back to service. And so you can follow them through the muster rolls, sometimes month after month after month, to see when they were there and when they were not there. That also starts to give you an idea of if they deserted or if there was some other story there. So building out a timeline using muster rolls or pay lists is a really interesting way to start to put together the story of your ancestors' military service. So those are some of the records that you can explore in Canada. And then lastly, actually not lastly, we have a couple of minutes, so I don't want to leave out our Australia friends. We'll take a quick look at that, and then we will look at the US. And then I do have one more thing to show you here on Ancestry before we wrap up. So for Australia, we're going to see Boer War indexes, right? So there are other conflicts that your countries may have participated in, and so you'll learn more about that here. Anzac Memorial records, lots going on there. So if somebody died in conflict, there almost always is record of it, and sometimes more records than available for those who survived those conflicts. So if somebody died in one of the plane crashes, or if they received a posthumous medal, or there will be newspaper reports of their death, or so lots of records are created in the case of somebody who dies in military service, and often fewer records are created if they lived through that service. And so keep that in mind as well. So we've got Cowra Military Camp. I'm curious about what a military camp is in this context. So yeah, explore the card catalog. That's what we've got available for Australia. And then we're going to come down here to the US, and we've got 1,100 databases of records. So here again, different countries participate in different conflicts. There are the world wars, some of the more involved global conflicts, and then you have some that are just specific to a few countries. So here in the US, we've also got the Mexican War. If you go back further in time, you've got the Indian, the French and Indian Wars. So just different conflicts that'll start to come to your mind as you think about the line of your family history. Another really interesting set of records for U.S. military, see if I can find it here really quickly, are what are called cruise books, Navy cruise books. So if your relative served in the Navy, there are 4.6 million records, and these actually go through 2009. And they're just like yearbooks. I know that's a pretty uniquely US concept, so apologies to our friends outside of the US, but basically each cruise, which is what a Navy sailing is called for a set of soldiers who are on a ship for a period of time, sometimes months and months, they would create like a yearbook of that sailing, of the soldiers or the seamen who were on that particular ship at that time, with photos, candids, notations, stories. Sometimes some of it is a little bit raunchy, but they've created these, and Ancestry has digitized a large collection of them. So if your ancestor served in the Navy, these are a great resource because not only do they go past some of the government record privacy laws, because these are just published by these individuals, but also they cover that time period for that record loss because of that fire. So there are just so many other ways to find clues about your ancestors' service. And I hope that you have heard that today, that you just see that you have to start to piece together everything, stick things in timelines, and what you're going to start to uncover, whether it's a grandfather's World War II service, 3 times great-grandfather's Civil War service, 5 times great-grandfather's American Revolutionary War service on any side of that conflict, you're going to start to see the story emerge as you piece together all of those little pieces of records that you're able to find. Okay, the last thing I want to share with you before we run out of time is this. On Ancestry, whether you have a subscription or not, if you have a family tree, you have the ability to keep track of who in your tree served in the military. One of the underutilized features on the site that I love is what we call my tree tags. So in your family tree, on any person in your tree, you have the ability to add a tag. And one of the tags that you can add is what we call a life experience tag, and it is military service. So whether they served in the military during a wartime or not, if they served in the military, you can tag that person with that relation or that life experience tag. That allows you to then go and find that person again in your tree, or pull up a list of all people in your tree who you've applied that tag to. Now, if you want to get more granular, you can, and in my case, I have. You also can create custom tags. You need to decide how you want to use custom tags, but here is one of the ways that I use them. I have created tags about specific military service. So I have a U.S. Civil War Confederate tag. I have a U.S. Civil War Union tag. So both that conflict was solely within this country, but 2 sides, and I have families on both. World War I and World War II. I haven't yet started my Revolutionary War service, though I do know a few people in my tree who served in the Rev War. But those are some of the specific conflict tags that I've created. So in addition to having this military service tag, I've also applied this custom World War II tag to my grandfather. And then what you can do is when you are viewing your tree, you can come over here to Find in Tree and click Filters, and you can then go find everybody in your tree that you have applied that particular tag to. And it will pull up the list of individuals that you've applied that tag to in your tree. Also use a combination of tags, or you can use a way to just search for the people that you've applied a custom tag to. So lots of different ways to use those, but I love my tree tags because the more my tree grows, the more or I want to make sure that I can find the things I'm looking for when I have an idea. Time and figure out what I'm going to do. I use my tree tags for that. I also want to be able to, when my nephew calls me because he's got some school report about World War II or about the Revolutionary War, and he wants to know who in our family served in that particular conflict, I can provide a list to him immediately, and then he can decide who he wants to focus on, and I can share information with him because I've collected all of that right there in my tree. So not only do I add tags, but I make sure I attach the records that I find. If you find a record elsewhere, so for example, you can contact the National Archives in your country or the state archives in your state to see what additional records they might have that are not yet digitized and not yet online. And oftentimes they will send them to you. Here in the US, what I often look for at the National Archives are the service records out of St. Louis to see if they survived, and pension files from the National Archives. So those two record sets you often have to write away for and have them send them to you if they have copies. So that's what I want you to be looking for, is other records that you can find and pull in. And then again, I'm going to upload those to my tree as long as the terms and conditions of the organization that owns those records allows for that. I'm going to transcribe those records in my notes. If I have photos, even if they're bad copies of photos that family members have given me or that I found in a newspaper online, I'm going to make sure that those are linked or uploaded so that those are available as well. Because for our military family members and for those of you who served in the military, I'm just so grateful for that service that they offer, often at great sacrifice, not just to them, sometimes in the form of their life, but also to their family members. So as you research the stories of your military family members, I hope that our time together today has given you some ideas about where you can go to find more records, about the vast resources available on Ancestry, fold3.com, newspapers.com, and how you can start to bring all of that information together in order to tell the story of your ancestors' military service. Because I don't know about you, but for me, I don't just do family history to see how far back in time I can go or how many famous people I'm related to, which is not many. I do it because I want to know the stories behind the lives that are living on my pedigree chart. So if this was useful for you today, before you go, I would love, whether you are watching this live on a Wednesday or whether you are watching this later on the Ancestry YouTube channel, if you would please, in the chat here live or in the comments there on YouTube, please leave a brief note about one new thing you learned today. That does two things. It helps me know if that we're pacing things right, we're doing this right, because I want to keep doing these Wednesday virtual events as long as I can to continue to show up and serve you in this way. But also, I think there's something really powerful about typing out what you learned. I think you're more likely to remember it. So if you will do that before you go, that would be fantastic. And if you go to ancestry.com/education, you will find the replay of this video if you need to watch it. It'll be there in a few days. There will be replays there of our previous Wednesday virtual events. And you'll also see our upcoming Wednesday virtual events that you can register for so that you can get the Zoom link so that you can show up and join us live here on Wednesday mornings. Until next time, I'm Krista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.